Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today I'm going to be doing a video where I'm going to be reviewing the missionary landscape and how to address them. So, just before I go to the next slide, the reason why I'm doing this is because for a while I'd been kind of thinking about the fact that, as you know, there's been some videos I've done about different missionaries groups. And one of the difficulties I sometimes have is that, every once in a while I'll come across something that's presented in a video, by a missionary. And it's kind of like one of those things where I find myself yelling at the screen, like, no, why would you say that? Sometimes not always to the missionary, sometimes the people that they're interviewing or asking questions to. Or I'll even say, well, wait a minute, the source is over here. Why don't you just pull out the actual source and read it? If you read it, it'll help you deal with what's happening. Um, so, you do that long enough and you start to say, okay, well, wait a minute, why don't I just discuss this issue? And I've discussed partially some of my ideas in other videos, but I want to do something where I kind of discuss what the landscape is that I see personally in this area of what missionaries are doing, with the idea, of course, to be to try to convince Jews to believe in some form of Christianity or Jesus belief, for example. And I want to try to respectfully, kind of deal with that, in the nicest way that I can. So the way I look at it is like this. At one point I thought about doing something very complex with every kind of different missionary that's out there, but I think I can kind of break it up into two sides. Um, and on the left side, which is here, is what I would call the more like YouTube video, Instagram kind of based kind of missionary. And the goal of these missionaries usually, and this being one of the guys who's a missionary, his site is known as Radar Apologetics. And this guy here, I couldn't quite find if he has like his own like actual site by itself, but I found some videos of his on what's called the archive, and this is the guy here. So this guy, yes, his name is Radar Apologetics. I can't remember fully his real name, and I don't want to make the mistake of saying his name wrong. But I know he claims to be like a Messianic rabbi. For example, he at one point in one video mentioned that he grew up Catholic, and that he essentially got ordination as a Messianic rabbi through a Messianic organization, which is important to even addressing some of the things he says, because his background as a Catholic is not that far, I would say, from what he believes as a Messianic or even as a online kind of missionary. Where this guy here, I think it's Sam Shamon is his name. He does a lot of videos where I think the main thrust of the video is to try to present that Jews don't know what we're talking about. Um, and one of the things I find that's important about his videos is he often posts these pictures as if this is the person he's debating, when in reality, this is not at all the person in the video at all. So on one side, the type of a missionary that's here is going to be someone who's online, and in some cases has a very kind of confrontational kind of presentation in the way they present things. Um, and I think they also only seem to debate people who have a certain knowledge base, and I'll get into that in a little bit, what I mean by that. So on one side, you have certain types of missionaries who, and again, I think for this side, mostly it seems that their point is to try to show people who watch their videos and who agree with their ideology or theology that they are smarter than Jews who don't hold by their ideology. It doesn't seem as much to be to try to convince a Jew of it, but more of just to kind of show that they're smarter than anybody who's Jewish on these topics. Um, and that's just the impression I get from the type of videos I do, and also the way that the video is structured. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. So on the right side, there's a different type of missionary that I notice. And one of them, I think this group here, So Be It, is connected to Jews to Judaism in some Jews for Jesus, sorry, in some way. I'm not quite clear on that, but I've noticed a video where it seemed to be that that was the case. And what this group does is that they go around to different places, like here in Israel, in Jerusalem, in different locations, and they will often kind of do almost like what seems to be like a nice and friendly interview with different Israelis that they meet. And the idea, mainly seems to be to try to present this idea that the people they're talking to don't really know the Tanakh in some way and are misinformed about like the New Testament and about Christianity and Jesus belief. What they often do is will present people to read certain things in a certain way, only like the air quotes that they want, if you will. But I also noticed that their videos are like professionally done and edited on some level. So I think that that's an important element to understand about the type of missionary work that they're doing. They also seem to be more geared towards kind of showing their audience or maybe their supporters that, look, we're doing this great work. We're really out there, and the Jews really don't know what they're talking about. The Israelis have no idea what they're talking about. So for example, someone saying, well, Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. Well, duh. That's in the New Testament. So what? It doesn't really mean anything. Um, but also, what's mentioned in the New Testament doesn't describe Hanukkah fully. It doesn't fully describe exactly what it means to, let's say, celebrate Hanukkah. So I've done a couple of videos on this group in particular. Um, and I sometimes always want to say I kind of wish I was in certain locations to where they come. And I also will be addressing like how if I was approached by them, what I would kind of talk about. And again, I find them very respectful. So that's the way I would treat it. There's no reason to be disrespectful in any way. And then on the other half of this, one of the most known messianic missionaries is a guy named Dr. Michael Brown. I've done a video about him before about some of the things he stated. Um, and this is kind of what I would say, his kind of approach is to try to also the kind of the be nice approach, to discuss with people and things like that. But I always find that many of the discussions from all of these sides seem to lack a certain something, and I want to address that. So on the right side, we have the kind of missionaries who are kind of, the ones who are presenting themselves as being nicer and as if they're open to discussion. They all Every single one of the groups, both sides, have this thing where they eventually will bring up the oral Torah as a part of like their thing of why Jews are wrong, or why Jews we don't know what we're talking about, or why, for example, as one guy was saying, well, why he can't believe in it, as if his belief in it is some crucial thing, or as if his background doesn't have some effect on what he believes or doesn't believe. So I want to kind of address some of these issues. So one of the things I want to address is the argumentation style um, that I find mostly on what you saw on the left side, the two guys on the left side and others like them, what they present and how they argue what they're trying to argue. And sometimes you find it on the right side, but it depends on who they're talking to. So what I mean by that is the following. There's a certain type of argumentation called shotgun argumentation, and it's where instead of simply addressing an issue, allowing the person to kind of like, either hold their opinion or whatever facts they have, the person just shoots out, like more questions and different questions, in different angles. So, for example, if you take this graphic, the person says, what about the opinions of others? And what about China? It's like, well, wait a minute, let me just finish this one point. Why do you have to ask all these questions in this like succession? Is it possible you really don't care what I'm trying to say? Or, you're trying to impress someone? And it's basically like it says in the graphic, using a large number of arguments so that the opponent is unable to answer them all. So what that allows the person who's on one side of the debate who's doing this to do is to say to their people who follow them, like, look, I tore the car apart in the argument. I tore them to pieces. I was all over the place. They couldn't answer anything. And it could be that the person on the other side is just being respectful. And it's like, okay, well, let me just make my point, you know. And one of the things I will find interesting about this type of argumentation I think sometimes it's used to try to get the idea that the person who's being asked the questions will, have to say at some point, I don't know, because I don't know the answers to everything. And that's a reality for any person. No person knows everything. So to throw all these questions at them, in some cases, they have no way to respond and they have no way to know what questions are coming. So another style that I sometimes notice in this, and this is a little bit, more enhanced, is what's called the post hoc ergo prompter hoc. And it's basically like, someone saying, okay, I have an opinion. And then this says, well, this happened after you said that, therefore you caused it. And it's kind of like, wait a minute, what? The correlation doesn't equal. Where did we get all this from all of a sudden? Um, and I find, for example, one of the arguments I find used often by missionaries in this vein is sometimes about like the oral Torah, where they'll like kind of present something, and the correlation doesn't match like what they're talking about. And I've talked in some videos about this, about the oral Torah. I have a number of videos about the oral Torah. Um, and I think, in some level I've covered this in terms of missionaries, about how literally, and I'll just kind of touch on this, that literally there's no way anybody can read ancient Hebrew without some form of oral instruction on how to read it, which the word Torah means instruction. Therefore, any instruction on how to read the Torah is oral Torah. And one of the easiest ways to know that is the written Torah does not include any description of what the letters sound like, the consonants. It doesn't even explain that there are consonants or vowels or what they sound like. And it further doesn't come with a dictionary or a grammar to explain, how the text is understood. So a person, on minor level would have to say, well, there's something oral, obviously, because ancient Hebrew was only taught orally. But that's a side point, But this is one of the tactics I've seen kind of missionaries use, where they kind of pull out something, and it's like it has no connection to what's being talked about, but it's kind of another tactic where the person, the Jew who's being kind of attacked in this way in the discussion, is being forced to kind of like answer every little thing, even if it has no connection to what's being discussed. Another idea is this idea of what's called poisoning the well. Where a person has an opinion and it's like, okay, it's like, I have an opinion, and the person's like, I'll take care of that. And they introduce a bunch of bad stuff, and it's presenting adverse information to discredit everything a person says. Um, so it'd be like, for example, someone saying, I want to talk about the oral Torah, but now I'm going to talk about how you stole your shoes. Or, it's like something that, is kind of made it to be out so that the person that they're discussing with is already villainized. In the discussion. Now there are some situations where you do have to bring up information about certain things, to kind of say, well, okay, well, this is the reason why, certain things you're talking about aren't relevant. But again, it doesn't have to be a breakdown to personal attacks. And I think that's one of the things that I would get out there. So what I find mostly is that with all of these two sides, no matter how nice they are, or how confrontational they are, to me, I just find it to be a scam. And there's some reasons why I say that, and I've also talked about this in some of the videos, but I haven't really called it a scam per se. But I would say, it's definitely a scam, and it's not a scam for money, but it's a scam for ideas, and it's a scam, for what I would say to be, um, misrepresenting certain ideas. And I have an example for that. So one of the missionaries I mentioned that's on the left side, the guy that was on the left bottom part of the graphic that talks about the divide between the landscape between the two sides. The guy his name is Sam Shamon, and he does videos on YouTube, and I think his video shows up in other areas. So this is one video I looked at once that he did, and it's called Yossi the Jew Debates Sam Shamon. So what's basically being portrayed here is this is supposedly Yossi the Jew, and this is a cartoon graphic of Sam Shamon, and it says intense debate. Now, one of the things that I have to say, if anybody goes back and watches this video, that first of all, this is a false representation. The whole graphic about the video is a false representation. Why do I say that? One simple reason. This person here that is the Jew that's portrayed in his video is not Yossi. I know this rabbi personally. He's from Brooklyn. His name is not Yossi, and he's not in the video. He's not at all in the video being debating with this Sam Shimon guy. Um, so this is a false representation. He's misusing this rabbi's likeness to portray that he's debating this rabbi in particular. And that's a false accusation. If you're going to show who you're debating, either show who you're debating, and if they don't have an image that they use or don't allow you to use their image, just simply make the video about what it's about. But to throw up these graphics as if you're like defeating in battle somebody who everybody knows, as a rabbi, well, I'll prove what I'm saying. This is Rabbi Aaron Raskin. This is, Aaron Raskin is the person he's presenting in this picture of his video. Aaron Raskin was not being interviewed in that video. So that's a misrepresentation to try to pretend as if he's debating and defeating, if you will, in a debate, this rabbi here. And you can see it's the same picture he used here. I think what probably happened is the Sam Shimon guy probably pulled up a picture of Rabbi Raskin and just kind of slapped it into the click image of the video to kind of make it seem as if he's really doing something in the debate. And I find that on the left side that I mentioned earlier, that there's this idea that they have to kind of show I'm like just defeating these guys left and right. So one of the things that I want to mention about that idea is that these are the kind of tactics that, are being used by, these kind of missionaries. Also, often I find it's an ego trip with dead ends. And what I mean by that is, I mean, if someone's having like a debate where it's like the idea is, like, well, let's find out what the truth is. I want to convince you of the truth, or I believe I have the truth, but I could be wrong. I could easily be wrong about something. Let's have a discussion about it. And in that circumstance, it isn't about trying to like show off how smart I am. It isn't about trying to stop someone from making their point. It isn't about interrupting them. It's about letting them get out their point, and then we can discuss the ideas and see what the evidence, where the evidence lies. But if the idea is that I'm going to show everybody that I'm better than this person and I know more than them and that they're so wrong so that I can build up my ego, then yes, I will cut them off. And then the discussion's a dead end because, personally, if I was in a discussion with someone that they invited me to and they won't let me make a point, they haven't convinced me of their point. If you haven't convinced me of your point, then the whole discussion's a dead end. If that's the idea, because a missionary by definition is trying to supposedly convince someone that they have a certain idea that's correct and the other person is wrong on some level. Um, and obviously, the idea would be is if they're trying to convince the person, that they would, be, kind of gearing their information to try to discuss and understand the person's point of view. So this brings me to the way I see these kind of issues and the way I would approach it, especially if I'm dealing with someone who, is willing to be respectful. Um, and I would first start with the idea that if somebody were to want to debate me or to offer me the ability to debate, or if I were to want to debate someone in this kind of area, the first thing I would do is I would set down some rules about what it is that we're going to be discussing and how the discussion is going to be, working. So, for example, if the person moderate, if there's no moderator, we may have kind of a gentleman's agreement. Okay, well, if you ask me a question, give me time to answer it. There's no reason that you should interrupt me. If I'm kind of droning in and out and I'm not answering your question after, I would say like 2, 3 minutes or 5 minutes, then, you can kind of bring me back in. But there may be a reason why I have to explain something in detail. And this is especially true when we're dealing with things that deal with ancient languages. There's no way possible for me, like, and this is something that comes up in my videos. When I used to start doing videos on YouTube, one of the challenges I had was I was kind of limited to the 10-minute mark on YouTube because I didn't like fully have my like channel activated fully. So that meant I had to hurry up and try to get information together in 10 minutes, which wasn't always easy. Why? Because there are some scenarios where there's a dearth of information that I have to present to someone who may not know Hebrew, who may not know anything about the language I'm presenting, and I'm having to kind of go through and explain what words mean. I may have to explain what the grammar means, and I may have to pull down several different sources to kind of make the idea. So eventually, when I got to the point where I could do more longer than 10-minute videos, there were times where I wanted to do like let's say a 20-minute video, and all of a sudden I'm at an hour and a half because it's just the I know for a fact that there are people who want to kind of know how certain ideas, where they come from. And, I know for a fact that, as a person who kind of, I taught myself Hebrew initially when I was like in my 20s. And then when I moved to Israel, my Hebrew got a lot better and I learned several different dialects of Hebrew. That took years to develop, and I'm still developing it because you still learn things every day if you're really searching for truth in every area that you're in. And even if you're fluent in Hebrew, you can still learn something because you can be fluent in a language and never fully understand the etymology of the language that you know or the history of certain statements, words, and text. So that's something I'm investigating all the time. I'm constantly trying to find information that either proves or disproves, on both sides, things that I hold by because I could be wrong about anything. So my approach is to first say, okay, well, let's decide what it is we're even talking about and what are the ramifications of it. If there's a moderator, if you're on his side on some level more than mine, let's just be fair. Let me have as much time as him to talk. I'll respectfully ask this person questions and I'll respectfully answer their questions. But there's no reason to kind of do these like shotgun questions where you're trying to trap me in certain areas and you're not giving me time. And be aware that there's things I don't know. Just like there's things that the other person doesn't know. There are things that I'm still investigating, figuring out. And sometimes I may make a mistake. I may tell you something and go back and look and say, I made a mistake in what I told you. It's this instead of that, which is, human. And that's why I say it's not about winning. So that would be the first approach that I would take. I would say, well, we got to have some ground rules if we're going to have this discussion and debate. Maybe it's not really a debate. Maybe it's just a discussion. Maybe we're just talking. And if it's not a debate and I'm not trying to win, for example, then we can have a discussion and it can be respectful. So then the next thing would be if I was to discuss with, let's say, a missionary, even if it's not a debate, if it's just a discussion, the first thing I would do, and I've done this in the past with missionaries who, come by my house here in Israel, it's actually legal to missionize, but the missionaries kind of find ways around the law, which, okay, so be it. You're a Jew, you keep Torah, you're going to have to deal with people trying to convince you to leave the Torah or to take on their particular ideas. So the first thing I have always said is, okay, well, if someone brings to me a book and says, "Hey, this book is something important, you need to believe in it," or you have to, accept certain things about it, or you should, the first thing I would say is, why should I consider this relevant? What makes this book relevant to where I should even consider it to be like, let's say, accurate history, as relevant, to my situation, relevant to even reality. You know, just a clear example here. These, for example, what you see here are English New Testaments, right? Well, one question is, well, and I'll get to this in just a second, but like, is this the original text itself? Is this the original language? Now, I don't require anybody to have the original text. That's not relevant, because if the text was written thousands of years ago, I don't expect you to have like the exact original text. That's not relevant to anything. But what I mean by relevant is, for example, let's say that this text makes a claim about a census that will supposedly have happened during, let's say, the Second Temple period. But let's say that I look up the history of any censuses happening at the time this text says, and I find that there were none during that time, and that the closest relevant source to something like that happened 100 years earlier than what this text claims, and it didn't happen anything like the text. Just a quick example, because I know some things about the New Testament. The New Testament at one point mentions the author, whoever wrote these particular texts, the authors. But the author of one of the texts has this census that happens in the story, and one of the things it mentions in the text is that the Jews who were living during the Second Temple period during this census had to go back to the places where their forefathers came from. Well, the first question I would say towards this relevance issue is, wait a minute, how is that even possible in the Second Temple period? How can you tell someone like, let's say, living in Jerusalem, go back to where your ancestors came from? Because the first question would be, well, which ones? What if my ancestors moved all the way, went to Babylon? I have to go to Babylon for a census? How does that even make sense? I'm right here. Write down my name right here. Are there census takers in where my father, great grandfather from 1,000 years came from? What's the standard of where I'm supposed to go? How do you manage a society where you tell everybody to go back to where their ancestors came from? Imagine, let's just take like the state of like New Jersey in America. Imagine if someone showed the governor of New Jersey said, "I want every New Jerseyan to go back to the place where their ancestors came from. Let's say from 1,000 years ago, and I want you to take part in a census in that location." You would have a complete upheaval of society if somebody told you to do something like that. That means if I'm a shop owner in Teaneck, New Jersey, I may have to leave New Jersey and go to like, let's say, Sicily. I may have to go to like, Africa somewhere. I may have to go to like, Senegal. And who are there going to be census takers in Senegal to take my information down? Well, which ancestors? What if I have ancestors that come from different locations? Which ones are the ones that I'm supposed to go by? Um, another thing, who's going to manage the shop while I'm gone? The whole family has to go? I mean, how do you manage a society with something like that? That doesn't make any sense. So that's a question well, that's not relevant to me. That doesn't make any sense. There's no way possible that had could have happened historically especially during the Second Temple period with no internet, no public transportation. How would they have gotten home or wherever that place is? That's not even home anymore. So that's something that I would say is like, well, why should I consider this relevant? This doesn't make any sense. Who's to say that you're the person who has a correct text that I should even listen to you? Who are you? So that's, a good question too. That like, okay, before I even enter what's in the text, I have to know why is it even relevant for me to even to listen to even read it? Why is it even relevant me to listen to the person who's presenting it? And here's another question. Okay, well, there's somebody who brings a New Testament to me and says, okay, well, maybe I should consider the Book of Mormon. On the front cover of this particular book of the Book of Mormon says another testament of Jesus Christ. But there are certain Christians who say, no, that's not a valid text. Well, why not? It has, it has the word testament on it. It has like Jesus Christ on it. So why is it not relevant? Maybe it's more relevant than these texts. Maybe it's just as relevant. But who gets to decide what's relevant and not relevant in this situation? So there are certain types of Christians who reject this book, but there are certain types of Christians who accept this book. So why should I listen to one guy over the next? What about this book? This is the Bible of the Black Hebrew Israelites by someone who has apostle in front of their name. Maybe they're valid. Maybe there's someone I should listen to. But someone may say, well, no, don't listen to those guys. But why not? What about these guys? Why is one situation or one theology not relevant compared to another one? And that applies to everything. I'm not saying it just applies to this particular scenario. If someone wants to convince me that physics works a certain way and they present to me a book on physics, well, I can look at other books. Why this book in particular? Why not another book? Why not another publisher? Why is this book specifically and all these other ones are not relevant, for example? So that would be the first thing that the person would have to show me why it's even relevant to consider this to be the text that we should even accept as reality, you know? So then the next thing is, concerning the New Testament in particular is, okay, why was this only preserved in Greek? If we're talking about Jews, the national ancestral language of Jews is Hebrew. Now, at the Second Temple period, Aramaic was also a pretty well-known language of Jews because of coming back from the exile in Babylon. Now, there was some Greek used, but most average Jews weren't like reading and speaking Greek. And also, you have to be aware, Greek intellectually and also linguistically and theologically in some many areas is a different cultural language than Hebrew is. So one of the problems you have with New Testament translations is, for example, there are New Testaments that missionaries have here in Israel that are written in Hebrew. But the first question someone should ask is, well, how do I know this translation from Greek, well, no, so I think specifically Koine Greek, is relevant or translated properly into modern Hebrew or even ancient Hebrew? What evidence do I have that the translation is understandable? For example, I think in Greek, if I remember correctly, there's a word called Deus, and I think in English is translated as God. And often, there's some people who could translate Deus into like I think Elohim in Hebrew. The problem is Elohim in Hebrew doesn't specifically mean what God means in English. Elohim means something different. I've covered that in several videos. In modern Hebrew, it does, but not in ancient Hebrew. In ancient Hebrew, the word Elohim or or Eloah has like a different meaning, which basically is associated with power or strength, and anything could have that, and it's not specifically towards like something that created the universe or something that's, a thing of worship. So it's just a cultural difference. So someone translating would have to already know that and be able to translate properly based on that idea. And, this is why I would say now the other thing is, I know a little bit of history about, the New Testament, so there's other ancient papyri out there, and none of these papyri have like who wrote them on them. So for example, there are, texts in the New Testament that says this person authored this part, this person authored that part. But then it's like, well, how do I know that? I need to know historically what I'm even looking at before I even try to enter into it. I need to know why it's even relevant and, who wrote it and what are the most ancient texts that are available or are important to me. Now, again, I'm not saying that you have to have the original one because there may not be an original one, and it may just simply be that somebody was recording something that they believe they experienced or think they experienced. But again, for it to be relevant for me to like say that this has to be something I have to take on or change my life because of it, well, then I need to have some details about like where the text came from and all that stuff. And again, this is simply for the sake of me saying this is the relevance of the argument. If we're going to debate something, let's first deal with what we're even talking about, so that also for the person on the other side, I can know where they're coming from, because there are a lot of things times where missionaries are saying they don't believe in something that we Jews that hold by Torah hold by, but they're only saying because the New Testament says so. They're not saying because they grew up and said they investigated it and they looked into it. There's one particular the one organization I showed in the video, one of the guys there, he actually does mention that in the video where he sees no where he's saying sorry about that, where he sees no evidence that the oral Torah exists. But then nobody in the videos I've ever seen has asked him, okay, well, what do you think the oral Torah even is? Which is a valid question. Okay, you say you don't believe in it, but what are you saying you don't believe in? What exactly is your concept of what the oral Torah is? So then you have the person explain it, and it's like, okay, well, maybe your explanation's wrong. As I mentioned before, we pull out a Torah scroll or an ancient Torah text from like, let's say the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's like, okay, well, wait a minute. How do you read this without some oral transmission of how to read it? There's no dictionaries here. There's no grammar books. How do you read it? So this is an important aspect of knowing. So then the next part, and I presented this in another video, one question is, okay, well, now that let's say we've entered into the New Testament, I want to find out who the major players are in the book before I really get into reading it. So for example, one example is the New Testament says that, Jesus had 12 disciples. Well, my first question is, who were they? I want to know some personal things about each one of them. If they were Jews, I need to know some things about them because I need to fact check whether or not these guys even existed, whether or not what they even maybe if they wrote anything, what they would write is relevant. How do I even know that the Greek texts that exist were authored by them in Greek? Was it authored maybe in Aramaic? Was it authored in Hebrew? Did they just kind of orally speak these things to people and the person and someone else wrote it? I need to know all these things because one of the questions I would have is, where are their writings? I want to see like as much as possible their writings because this wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was about, we're talking about 2,000 years ago, but there's a lot of writings from about 2,000 years ago. Once you start getting past 2,000, 200 years ago, that's where you start getting a breakdown in text because most papyri and also many Torah scrolls and also texts written on animal skins will break down at somewhere about the 1,000 year mark to a little bit more. So I'd be looking for okay, well, I would expect personally, this is just a personal expectation, that if there were 12 guys there who supposedly were supposed to be these leaders, there should probably be 12 accounts of what happened. Because if again because one of the challenges you have is that the New Testament internally, doesn't give a lot of details about most of these guys, and if not, most of them. There's only like a couple of them that are kind of focused on, but then it talks about the 12 over and over again. But it's like, okay, well, I need to know who these people are, because one of the other things I need to know is where are their children? What happened to the children of the 12 disciples? Did they continue to believe what their fathers believed? We're told that in the New Testament they left their families behind, which obviously would have had a social, economic impact on their families. So that's, a bit of a, area where I would need to know, okay, well, what happened to the, let's say the first generation or the second generation of these guys? What happened when they were gone? Who were the Jews who followed them and led this whole thing? You know, why is it that historically speaking, when I've looked through history, I don't see anything Jewish, like Jewish Christians, past about the second generation of Christians. So somewhere about 200 CE, you don't see any Jews being identified as being Christians, like people you can name. You don't see traditions being passed on by them. You don't see text being passed on by Jews who are identified as Jewish Christians. So, for example, at 1,500 years ago, who were the Jewish Christians back then? Where were they? If they disappeared, why did they disappear? Why weren't they, just moving and shaking, and surviving like, Jews, to do today. And, Jews of today are predominantly, descendants of the Jews that the New Testament badmouths, a lot, and says that, we're this and that, but, they survive, their descendants survived where these guys didn't. So this is an important aspect of it. Now, someone may ask me, well, why is this even important to you? Why would you present it in that way? Because it's from the Torah. The Torah tells me I have to do that. And the Torah, according to the text itself and according to the oral tradition of all ancient Jewish communities, the Torah was from the creator of all things himself, Hashem. And that's the foundation that's presented in the Torah. It requires a particular line of thinking. There's always a foundation that you have to start from. So, if someone wants to present something to me as fact or as something that I need to consider, well, I need to know where the foundation starts first. And that's an important line of thinking because, again, that takes away a lot of the argumentation or the ego. If we can first deal with the foundation and then we can start talking about, maybe some of the meatier issues. But that's, an important point. So what I would suggest is if you're looking at this video and you've kind of, noticed the things I'm talking about, I have a number of videos where I've kind of addressed some of these different issues in more detail. I've done a number of them where I've kind of done internal review of the Torah itself, the Tanakh itself in Hebrew, and I've also addressed the oral Torah. Often what I'll do is sometimes I'll watch some of these videos that missionaries put out, and I'll kind of make a video that responds to it for people who really don't have the sources in front of them, because that's one of the things I find is important. I'm not one of those people. Don't believe me just because I say it. Actually go and do the research. Look at the text, and learn the languages for yourself, and then you'll know for sure whether or not something's true or not. Because it isn't about me. It's not about me trying to prove that I'm like, so much smarter than everyone. Because like I said before, I'm always learning. I'm always learning. Just this morning, there were some things I didn't know that I was learning. Just yesterday, I was in a discussion about something where I had some of the things I was saying right, and then I had looked and researched more of what I said and said, I missed something here. I need to like tell this person that this is like now the full story because I missed something here and here. And that's a part of life. I mean, no matter how old you get, you always have room to learn. And that's the thing about being a Torah-based Jew. There's always room to learn. So, these like to say, this is the videos I would say I suggest. I'll put links to the playlist in the description. Of the debunking missionaries. My reaction to various missionaries and the oral Torah. So in conclusion. Um, that's the kind of the way I see the landscape. And as I mentioned before, I kind of thought I would make it more complex by kind of going over like different groups. But that's I thought about it. I was kind of like, well, there's really not a lot of difference between these groups. It's just whether sometimes they're nice or they're not, whether they're trying to like, make this huge point as like a shotgun argument, or whether they're just kind of like playing it like the what do you call it, the slow game or the kind of the long game, in this whole situation. So, again, this is Ever from the Chronicles of Ever. And thank you for listening. Take care and bye.